Thanks again to Vapor Central for hosting us and all the staff here. You've been so great today. Just again, too, we're streaming on POT TV. So if you missed some things earlier in the day that you want to check out, it'll all be on pottv.com. So you can check it out there. And today, yesterday's speakers are streaming as well. Next was supposed to be the National Indigenous Medical Cannabis Association, but they could not be here. So instead, we have the wonderful Jamie Shaw, who's going to read a statement from them to start us off, and then get into some kind of legal ground surrounding that. And then Catherine Thomas is here to give us some U.S. perspective around that issue, too. And Jamie Shaw is the Government Relations Director for MMJ Canada, both a former director and former staff member of the BC Compassion Cub Society, where her work comprised of various roles, including communications. Jamie also served 3 terms on the board of directors of the Canadian Association of Medical Cannabis Dispensaries, 2.5 of those as president. Her successful lobbying in Vancouver led not only to the city implementing licensing for dispensaries under prohibition, but also the creation of a second class of license based heavily on the BCCS model and requiring membership in CAMCD. She's also the co-founder of the first Canadian chapter of Women Grow in Vancouver, an awesome organization that kind of empowers women and gives them networking opportunities in the city. There is a chapter in Toronto as well, if anybody's interested in checking it out. Jamie is also a co-author of the Lyft Cannabis Retail Training Course, the first of its kind in Canada. Her writing can also be found on Lyft and the cannabis resource site CanLeo. And Catherine is a community and physician liaison. She's hooking patients up with the medical system, giving them the information they need to empower their choices, and facilitating doctor visits as well. So we'll give you guys a big Vapor Central welcome and start us off. Thank you.
So yeah, I wanted to kind of start by acknowledging that we're not the people that are supposed to be here. We're supposed to be the Kentucky Cannabis Association. So I wanted to start by reading a statement that they made in July and apologize for any mispronunciations. We are on right off the bat. Onkwehonwe people who provide access to cannabis products and other natural medicines in Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. We are Onkwehonwe, and as such, we uphold our people's traditional decision-making process through our clans, nation, and confederacy. We do not recognize the authority or jurisdiction of foreign entities such as the Tyendinaga Police or the elected band council on our lands, culture, economy, and politics. Cannabis is a healing plant, and we are providing it as a medicine for people who need it. Our activities heal people and do not cause them harm. As Onkwehonwe people, we have an intrinsic right to use natural medicines to heal ourselves and an intrinsic responsibility to provide medicine to all those who need it. We do not need permission to uphold our responsibilities to be who we are. We have a process for making decisions and resolving our differences through our clans and traditional systems. We will not tolerate the Tyendinaga Police or the elected band council encroaching on our rights and responsibilities and trying to usurp the authority of our clans and decision-making structures. Any attempt to close down our operations will be treated as a threat to our livelihood and an interference in our way of life and will be dealt with accordingly. We are willing to meet and counsel with those who wish to discuss this matter further with us. So that's their statement. Before I kind of talk about the, yeah, absolutely, please. Before I talk about where that sort of lands within our legal system, I met Catherine earlier today, and we were talking about the Paiute tribe in Las Vegas, where I used to live. And so I asked Catherine to come and kind of talk about what's going on, what the status is in the States right now. Obama a couple years ago said that basically the reserves were free to do whatever they wanted to with cannabis. So how has that turned out?
So thanks for having me. I don't know. Are we on? Yeah? Okay. Thanks for inviting me here to speak, Jamie, today. So we just had an informed conversation this afternoon, and that's how I ended up here. As Jamie said, and we were speaking about the partnership that Ultra Health formed with a failing tribe in Las Vegas, the Paiute tribe. So obviously it was a topic of interest to me, not only because I would hope that we could look at this plan that they're using in Nevada right now to try to find a way to implement this and work in a partnership in Canada. The tribe was failing. They were only yielding about $3,000 in tobacco sales, and people were leaving the tribe. Now, after forming, from my understanding, I just read the first quarter sales in 2016 after this partnership was formed, and they had $40 million in revenue that was brought to the tribe. There's charts that are forecasting the profits to make this a sustainable tribe again, and cannabis is helping healing First Nations people, and they're working together to form healing centers, which also involves tribal healing forms that natives could be using in conjunction with these healing centers in medical ways as well, in healing people with cannabis. And so this needs to be looked at in Canada, and we need to try to form some type of partnerships with whomever it is. That's what we're interested in forming partnerships so we can help and assist not only with the sales by making the tribes viable again and giving everyone fair access. I don't think it's just limited to First Nations, but it's a good way to start to look at things for sure.
Thank you. And I'm extremely glad that both Jack and John are here, because there might be some interesting Q&As after, because I have to say, when I started reading just the legal history of where First Nations people actually stand in Canada, it brought me further and further and further back in time, down all kinds of like twisted, where a judge would interpret one thing one way for 30, 40 years, and then suddenly a judge would start interpreting something completely different. And you know our relationships aren't good, but in 150 years, I think they would have been at least defined since Confederation. The issue actually goes back like 131 years before Confederation. The Royal Proclamation of 1736, they don't even really agree right now whether or not that document actually recognized First Nations rights, but it did definitely set aside clear tracts of land which they had some measure of autonomy. And then it also further attempted to prevent encroachment onto those lands and other lands. That got a little more complicated with the passing of the Indian Act in 1876, meant to address many of these inconsistencies. Amendments over the years. I've seen government agents get deciding votes at band council meetings, residential schools, and a host of other culturally devastating and suppressing laws, including not only the practice of the potlatch and other ceremonies, but also the prohibition on hiring a lawyer to press for rights. With over 20 amendments, the Act looks pretty different today, but many of the provisions are still really troublesome, particularly when it comes to new cannabis laws. We know, the Ontario announcement isn't really that big of a surprise. Who gets jurisdiction over what is pretty much the same across the board. So we knew the provinces were going to have a certain amount of power. But it starts to become difficult when you try and place where the reserve fits within federal and provincial, because in many other cases, they're actually above provincial law or equal to. They're usually directly under the federal government at all, and then there's certain cases where they can actually argue for provisions that they're doing something for their people. Specifically, Section 12 and Section 88 of the Indian Act are probably the most confusing. There was a Supreme Court of Canada case, and again, I'm going to screw up the pronunciation, Delgamuukwi versus British Columbia. It was first filed in 1984. When the ruling finally came down in 1997, the majority quoted Section 12 by saying that the game laws of the province shall apply to Indians within the boundaries thereof, to conclude that this must contemplate their application to all Indians within the province without restriction as to where they are within the province. This conclusion on Section 12, they felt, allowed them to ignore any Section 88 arguments. The dissenting opinion, however, found that Section 12 deals only with Indians, not with reserves. The opinion also argued that another section, 9124, explicitly separates Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And I also apologize for using this word all the time. It's the legal law word that's there. And since only Indians are mentioned in Section 88, that section would not apply to lands that are actually reserved for Indians. So there's the dissenting opinion on there. They didn't actually add anything new to the argument because it had been ongoing for quite a long time at this point. This ruling did suggest that provinces could impinge on Native rights but could not extinguish them. It also established that the constitutionality of Section 88 could be legitimately questioned, though it was not the matter in front of the court. So basically, they just sort of punted, didn't really speak on it one way or another, just said, we don't have to touch this, and so we're not going to. The case also highlighted that the government of BC had been violating Aboriginal title in an unconstitutional and therefore illegal manner ever since it joined Confederation in 1871. Though again, that was not the matter before the court. So while the court actually decided that, it didn't actually have any weight, and BC is technically still treating Aboriginal title in an unconstitutional manner. In 2009, a Saskatchewan provincial court judge ruled that provincial laws do not apply on Indian reserves. The case has not made its way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and so the majority and dissenting opinions still stand from the previous case. The individual treaties mentioned above also still confuse things because some bands have never formally entered into treaties. The amendments to the Indian Act that saw federal Indian agents oversee band council elections has led to a pretty severe split between who's actually speaking for a lot of the reservations and a lot of the tribes and who the tribe believes should be speaking for them. And those splits exist pretty much right across the country. And so while the federal government has very clearly stated what jurisdiction the province will have when it comes to cannabis, we're still not actually sure whether this actually applies on reserves or not. These barriers in these systems, they greatly affect First Nations communities, and there's an interesting question there as well. The Canadian government has a fiduciary duty to the First Nations people. The definition of this duty includes the provision that good conscience requires the fiduciary to act at all times for the sole benefit and interest of the one who trusts. The Indian Act states that reserves are to be held for use and benefit of the Indians. So if a band decides that cannabis as a crop, whether it's for medical or other purposes, hempcrete might be a great benefit to them. That's the purpose of this reserve land. So just how much authority the federal government has to impose onerous licensing restrictions on something a band has undertaken to benefit themselves is a pretty open question that delves into things that have been long-standing, unresolved issues. Again, in BC, this becomes even larger with the black and gray markets. They're very sophisticated, mature, and massive. They're capable of going toe-to-toe with a nationwide system of licensed producers. Politicians and law enforcement continue to cover the civil disobedience of the cannabis industry as criminal activity, and we've seen that recently in the Tonendanaga standoff, where the Kentucky Association actually is 10 businesses on the reserve, and that have banded together to kind of say that this is what they're doing, this is what they're doing it for. So then, of course, however these issues are resolved, that still leaves open what happens off the reserve. Can they trade with other reserves? Because it means, moving things between reserves where technically they don't have sovereignty over that land according to the treaties. So it leaves a lot of open questions about where they stand. So, were there any questions at all that maybe we can answer? Possibly, maybe, yeah.
For the Daniels decision around Métis, they granted Métis the same rights as First Nations. Are you aware of any, action on that front in terms of opening storefronts and other businesses?
Not really. You know, I'm kind of surprised. I have to say, I grew up just outside Akwesasne during its heydays as cigarette smuggling and among many other things. And I have to say, I was very surprised that I wasn't surprised it was the Mohawks, but I was surprised it was the Tyendinaga that went that way. But the Akwesasne Reserve is kind of an interesting one because it straddles 3 borders, and they have their own issues that actually again, haven't been sorted out. So some of this stuff gets really difficult. That reserve crosses the Canadian, US, Ontario, Quebec border. And those jurisdictions are very strangely defined, and the reserve is right across, right through those whole barriers. For a long time, they didn't have to go through customs, which was a good thing, because sometimes one single building was in all 3 places. And so that a radio station also was actually right on the international border, where half of it was in the US and half of it was Canada, and it's actually a pirate radio station called CKON, which is actually a play on Seacon, which means welcome. And so it's like, actually, it's North America's only pirate radio station left. So I was really surprised it wasn't them, and then to find out that there's 10 at least 10 businesses that joined together to issue this statement in Tyendinaga. It's really interesting how it can take off in certain areas, but I don't think I really answered your question very well. There's a lot of questions. We don't really know, right? Like, again, it has to do with, like, you would think, because normally it's sort of assumed that they're under federal jurisdiction, so then they would have to apply through the ACMPR. But there are some questions there about if they were only doing it for their reserve, would they have to do that? And then, of course, bigger questions if they're doing that for other reserves. So it ties into that as well. So there's a lot. And again, many of these communities, as we've seen recently with the pipelines in BC, there's often a very strong split between the band council, the elected band council, and the elders and the tribal leadership. And that's why you would sometimes see stories where, oh, this tribe supported the pipeline, and yet there's stories the same day saying the tribe totally rejects the pipeline. That's because usually the elected officials got a bribe, signed off on it, and that's an ongoing reality in many of these reservations. So, yeah.
Yeah, that is true. I have found that in several instances as well, is that the tribe may be in approval of cannabis or a healing center, but then it's vetoed by the band council or the chiefs. So it's hard to make progress if they have to learn, I think, amongst each other to work progressively. I know there's a reserve in Brantford that is working conjunctionally all together. So everyone's in approval. They have partnerships for this wonderful healing center that's including counseling for patients and access to cannabis. And again, the cost is always a factor with cannabis as well. So having it available on the reserves by them cropping themselves, I think looking at them as having access like that as well is a good way to look at things.
Yeah, and even as I said, even if it's just hemp, for hempcrete,
Yeah.
right? That can improve lives considerably on many reservations.
Any other questions? Oh, perfect. Hey, Jonathan, nice to see you. Question from our next guest speaker.
Oh, Jonathan, I came to see you.
Hey, sorry if I missed this part, but I was just wondering if you have any information about insurance coverage from the federal government for ACMPR obtained cannabis for First Nations or Native people, because there is coverage for drugs through the federal government, and so wondering if there's any progress on that front.
So part of my job includes trying to find coverage for patients as well. I feel a lot of patients are socially and economically discriminated, as that's why I'm trying to have a conversation with you as part of my job. And personally, I feel that we need fair access. I have had conversations with First Nations and Indian Affairs. They are looking into the same way as other companies are looking for coverage, is essentially waiting for a DIN number to be assigned to the cannabis is basically the roundabout answer that I received from First Nations. So again, billing becomes a problem problem because there's no DIN number assigned and there's no way that we can actually bill for cannabis. So I'm striving and hoping to, as well as I know you are as well, is we are trying to provide patient coverage, whether it's through provincial human rights commissions, approaching benefit companies, as you well know, you've been through that. So my main focus is to find coverage for First Nations, and we all have the same problem right now in Canada. Is it's for the patients that it's working for, that's wonderful, but the cost is the problem, and it's boiling down to that. So the government now needs to look at a way that, how are we going to find a way to cover this cost, because the patient needs to have the option to fare the way they want to be treated, whether it's with pharmacists or through cannabis. They at least deserve the option, and that's what is my march for this. Whether it's First Nations patients, ODSP patients, Ontario Works patients, WSIB patients, we need coverage for these patients. And I've approached all of them as well as you. So as long as we keep trying, I mean, I see it coming for sure, and it's well deserved for patients who definitely need it.
Catherine, Jamie, thank you so much. That was like very good. Buckle in, we're almost done, but I see it's filled up in the back there a little bit too. So welcome to the NORML Canada Conference. We're streaming on POT TV, so you can check out earlier in the day online, and yesterday's conference online as well.